Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 44 and be with me in the book of Hebrews. We're going to study 3 verses today, mostly around Moses and his leaving Egypt and keeping the Passover and going through the Red Sea. Today's title is The Red Sea Isn't Flat, and that's going to come into our study today. The Red Sea is 3,500 feet deep. It's 2/3 of a mile deep. It's amazing. These people went into this big trench. All right, so we're talking the big picture here today, which we're going to illustrate with the Red Sea in a minute, is that we're talking about faith. We're in the Hall of Fame of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11, and faith has a thinking element. That is the way you think, the way you consider God. And then there's this unseen element because there's this future that you don't see. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Abraham didn't see where he was going. So we have been meditating on faith, and two of the things is how we think about God and what's that unseen part. What can we see and what can't we see? Then there's this third element, which is this time element, and it's how we consider God before. There's always a before we get all the information. So how we see him before we kind of fully see him. And it's how we think before we fully see. All right. And then the last thing is the difficulty element. So faith is applied best, or maybe even only, in trauma, in adversity. And we're going to see it here with battling this powerful Egyptian king and battling this destroyer of the firstborn. Maybe that's an angel. And then finally, just gravity and the depth of water of the Red Sea. Okay, so let's look at these 3 verses. The first one's going to be about leaving Egypt. The second one's going to be about the Passover. The third one's going to be about crossing the Red Sea. This is from Hebrews chapter 11. I'm going to start with verse 27. By faith he left Egypt, talking about Moses here. By faith Moses, left Egypt, not being afraid. So he's telling us how Moses is thinking, not being afraid of the anger of the king. That's the Pharaoh. For he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So it mentions specifically that unseen thing. Verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn, that's capitalized, destroyer of the firstborn, might not touch them. And then the third example, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Okay, so verse 27 talks about leaving Egypt. You remember that the Israelites were in Egypt. They had grown numerically, and then God wanted to let his people get free. He raised up Moses. He went to Pharaoh with the 10 plagues. And Moses has the faith of seeing God as greater than and more powerful, and his allegiance is to God more so than Pharaoh. So his thinking was not being afraid of him, and doing this unseen part. So seeing him who is invisible, who put the invisible before him almost as a visible thing. So it says there in verse 27, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So I love how it emphasizes our second point about faith. The first point is that it's the way we consider God. Secondly is there's always an unseen scene and a seen element. The third one is there's a time element. The fourth one is there's a difficulty element. And when he leaves Egypt here, it's as if the second element is being honored. It's seeing him who is invisible. And Moses has this visibility. He almost like sees God who is currently invisible. Of course, there's a time element that he has to do this before he knows how this is all going to turn out, and the difficulty. So let's think about this. This was done at great risk. This is, Pharaoh had the most A1 tanks in the world at that time, which were chariots. The greatest piece of military technology of its day, the force multiplier, the chariot. And the value element here, of course, that he values the presence and obedience in the people of God more so than Pharaoh and his riches and the pleasures of sin. Okay, verse 28. So he keeps the Passover, not just the Passover. It's called the Lord's Passover. So Moses was sort of given the Passover. The Lord invented it, gave it to Moses. It started with him, and it's sprinkling blood with hyssop over the doorpost. So the thinking is that God commanded it, and I'm going to do it. So the promise is going to have an effect. It's the Lord's Passover. The Lord sees us, and the Lord is going to pass over, and is going to prevent the destroyer of the firstborn from coming down. So there's this time element. Of course, he has to be obedient with the hyssop before this happened to prevent the destroyer of the firstborn coming down. And the Passover is what you do with a lamb, but it's also what you do with blood, and it's also what you do with the destroyer of the firstborn. So the Lord will pass over and not allow the destroyer to enter. This is, truly, truly terrifying. So this faith that you have to keep the Passovers is the faith that the harm can be prevented by blood. And similarly, we today in 2023, or whenever you're listening to this, we have to have the exact same faith, or very similar at least, that we have to believe that the blood of Jesus that can prevent what should prevail against us. The destroyer, the penalty of sin can be averted and not allowed to enter into my life. How? By the blood of Jesus. So we admire and honor Moses for this faith in the power of the blood, in the ability of the blood, and we must have the same faith. So finally, the Red Sea. We got to get to that. The Red Sea is 3,500 feet deep, and every single person that crossed the Red Sea had to vote with their feet. That is, they had to go down into this huge trench, this 3,500-foot trench. So how long, if the water came over the top of you, how easily could you get to the top? If it was 5 feet deep, everybody would survive. If it was 10 feet deep, everybody would survive. If it was 50 feet, maybe half the people would survive. If it was 100 feet deep, maybe 1 out of 10 would survive. Well, how about 3,500 feet deep? It's deep, and every person had to vote with his feet and ask the question, hey, is this deep enough to drown? The answer for every person was yes. So who should I be afraid of, the Egyptians or the power of the Lord? So these examples are all for our encouragement and instruction. We are to have the faithfulness of Moses before Pharaoh. We're supposed to have the respect of the Lord from his Passover and his ability to avert and not allow the destroyer by blood. And thirdly, we're supposed to vote personally with our feet with the Lord. Thanks for listening.